Hello, human geographers. We are back at it this evening to discuss our final topic from our Industrialization and Economic Development unit, and that is on improving development. How does a country attempt to improve its level of development? And so we're going to be looking at that from an individual nation standpoint as well as a overall global standpoint. So let's get started. There's two broad categories of ways that a country can improve its level of development. One is known as the self-sufficiency approach, and the other is the international trade approach. The self-sufficiency approach, as you can probably guess, depends largely on a country doing everything for itself, whereas the international trade approach says we don't have to do everything, we just have to be able to trade for what we need. So we need to focus on what we do well, and then we can get everything else through trade. So let's take a look at those a little bit more in depth. Starting out with the self-sufficiency approach. So some of the characteristics as well as things that are on the more positive side of the spectrum for the self-sufficiency approach. We start out with the fact that just what it is. A country will attempt to spread development or investment across multiple sectors. So primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector. Spreading it across all these different sectors, spreading that investment to try and improve how much you grow, how efficiently you grow it, manufacturing as well as services. So trying to improve everything across the board. Now, the growth in this case, because it is spread out, the investment isn't as targeted, means that the growth is not going to be very rapid. It's going to be modest, but it's going to be distributed across multiple sectors, so it's going to end up being a little bit more even. Now, when it comes to this particular approach, countries have to try and insulate themselves from other outside influences. And we're going to explain why here with the international trade approach. But basically, under the international trade approach, a country will focus on what they do well. And by focusing on what they can do well, they improve efficiency, which drives down costs. Now, how that impacts countries under the self-sufficiency approach is that, well, there might be better products at a cheaper price elsewhere. And so, in order to help maintain that even development across multiple sectors, they have to limit imports, limit competition so that people have to buy from their country. And so there are a few ways that countries have done this in the past. Very high tariffs, which are import taxes. So by taxing those imports, putting that tax on them, you're effectively raising the price of your competition to the point where people go, oh, well, now it's more expensive because of the import tax. We're not going to buy this product from another country. We're going to buy our local product. As well as quotas, saying there's only so much we're going to import. We're only going to import X amount or whatever it may be. Now, in the past, India and China developed their countries using the self-sufficiency approach. But even now, we don't see that all that often. In fact, most countries don't use the self-sufficiency approach anymore. Even India and China are no longer doing that. And so, and there's a couple of reasons why. So on the negative side, the problem side of this, a couple of reasons why most countries aren't engaging in this is because effectively you are protecting inefficient businesses and industries and services and things like that. You're trying to prop up things that otherwise, if the market, managed itself, these would fall off because they wouldn't be competitive. And in addition to that, you need a very large bureaucracy, a very large organizational system to help facilitate this. So those are some of the problems, which is why most countries have begun to engage in the international trade approach. And so under the international trade approach, countries will begin to identify their unique economic assets. And that's really important because a country has to reflect on itself. Okay, what do we do really, really well? Whether that is their labor force, it could be very, very skilled, or it could be, on the other end of the spectrum, it may be less skilled but very low wage. That could still be a unique economic asset that a country has. It could be raw materials that they have or have access to. A particular climate for growing a particular crop. It could be the infrastructure that they have. It could be unique site and situational characteristics. It doesn't necessarily matter what that unique economic asset is, but a country has to identify, what do we do better than just about everyone else? What can we do? What can we produce at a higher quality for a lower price? And that is what we call a comparative advantage. Is that if you buy something from country X, you know it's going to be a better quality, it is going to be cheaper because they're more efficient with it than country Y. It's a comparative advantage. So there's a couple different examples that we're going to look at. One example that we're going to look at on the next slide are the 4 Asian tigers. And we actually have a video case study on Singapore, one of the 4 Asian tigers, that looks at their unique economic asset. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. As far as the Arabian Peninsula states, I want to ask you guys, what unique economic asset do you think they have? What were they able to do better than just about anyone else? At perhaps a lower price than just about everyone else? What did they have a comparative advantage with? And hopefully you thought oil. Because that was the unique economic asset that the Arabian Peninsula states had that allowed them to develop so rapidly, as we're going to see here in a minute. Now, as with everything, it's not all sunshine and rainbows with this. There are negatives, there are problems with this. So let's identify those. That under the international trade approach, unlike self-sufficiency, there was going to be very even resource distribution. Even with companies that were less efficient, they were still getting the same amount. In this case, you're saying, we know we're not going to do that. We know we're not going to do agriculture. We know we're not going to do a lot of services, whatever it might be. So there's uneven resource distribution because you're identifying, okay, what do we do? Oh, we're going to focus on the secondary sector, those newly industrialized countries. We're going to focus on manufacturing. We're going to lure some of those manufacturing jobs from MDCs to semi-periphery states. So we're going to focus on that at the expense of other things. And then in addition to that, there's also going to be increased interdependence, which can be a good thing, can be a bad thing, depending on your stance on dependence. If you want your country to produce everything that it does, then self-sufficiency might be the approach. However, if you're okay depending on food and products and things like that coming from other countries, then the international trade approach is a way to go. In addition to this, it's also more susceptible to market decline. What we saw in the late 2000s, 2008 roughly, 2008, they called it the first global recession. Why? Because so many countries were dependent on one another. That when the market collapsed in MDCs, people in MDCs didn't have as much money to spend on other products, which then affected the income for a lot of LDCs. And so there is that element to it as well, that if there is a market decline in a very prominent MDC country to the point where they're not buying as much as they have been, well, that could affect a much greater percentage of the global population than if there was a decline in a country that's practicing self-sufficiency. Now, essentially what we've seen is that most countries in the world have begun to focus on this because it's a little bit more targeted. It's a little bit easier to focus in on a particular economic asset, but some countries have struggled to identify their unique economic asset within the global market. So that has been a struggle for some countries as well. Hasn't changed the fact that a lot of countries have pursued this, leading to increased globalization and things like that. Now, we mentioned the four Asian tigers as a group of countries or a group of states that have pursued the international trade approach. And so here are the four Asian tigers: Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. Now, the definition of statehood could be debated here a little bit. But these countries pursued an export-driven economy, meaning that they were shipping out. And a lot of it was electronics. A lot of it was consumer goods that were assembled by a very skilled labor force. There was a lot of focus on education and developing a skilled labor force, in which case electronic companies brought manufacturing to these areas to produce higher quality goods that could be sold for a higher price on the international market, which in turn helped a lot of these countries. And so these four Asian tigers, which are also referred to as the four Asian dragons, the four little tigers, the gang of four. So if you hear any of those, they're referring to these states. Pursued very, very high quality education that improved the labor force, had a very skilled labor force, which led to very rapid industrialization, as we're going to see on the next slide. And so we have to wonder, are we starting to see some emerging tigers? Because essentially what happened is that, and we talked about this during our manufacturing regions discussion, that manufacturing from Japan, especially low-skilled, low-wage electronic manufacturing in particular, as well as other manufacturing, moved out of Japan when the labor force became very skilled. They moved to China. Well, now China is rapidly industrializing. China has a very skilled labor force, so we're starting to see it move out of China as well. We're starting to see it move into India. Well, the southern parts of India are very educated, high-skilled labor force. So then the question is, where are we going to see that in the future? It's kind of an interesting topic to pursue. And so taking a look at this is just looking at some of the Asian tigers, as well as some of the Arabian Peninsula states that developed very, very quickly. Okay? And especially with Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, you can see two images of the same region and how it changed in a fairly short amount of time. You know, just take a look at how those things changed, how the skyline changed. That was very rapid development in those countries. And all of these countries, what they have in common is that they pursued the international trade approach and went from countries that were very much below the Brant line, LDC countries, to very developed countries that have more in common with MDCs now than they do with LDCs, despite the fact that they are still south of the Brant line and might still be referred to as LDCs. We know that's not the case. The evidence doesn't support that. And that's important to remember. All right, shifting gears a little bit. In this portion of the lecture, we're going to be talking about the Millennium Development Goals, okay, and then the new goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the first part of our lecture, we talked about how countries could pursue improving their levels of development. Well, at the global scale, we've also seen strategies to try and improve levels of development for the entire planet. For countries, regardless of what they're doing within the country, there's ways that we could try and improve levels of development in these countries as well. And so the Millennium Development Goals were a particular set of goals that were established by the United Nations and member countries to try and improve global development, try and improve every country. And they were established in the year 2000 based off data from 1990. So when you see 1990, that's just going off the numbers from 1990. Okay? Then we're going to measure that. They were measured in 2015 to see, did we meet those? So here were the 8 goals, and we're going to go into all 8 goals and the 18 target goals as well. Okay, talk about them, give you lots of statistics about them, and then identify whether or not those were met. Okay, so here were the 8. Eradicate extreme hunger and poverty, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and develop a global partnership for development. Now, we have passed 2015 at this point, so the question I want to pose to you guys right now is, which of these goals did we achieve? Okay, maybe put a star next to the ones that you think that we met. Which ones do you think we didn't meet this? Put an X next to those. And then, finally, which ones do you think are most important to achieve? Regardless of whether we got there or not, which ones do you think would you have placed the highest priority on? And as we go through these, we're going to take a look at them. All right? So here we go. All right. So starting with goal number 1, we had 3 target goals that were part of this. The first target was to cut in half between 1990 and 2015 the proportion of people whose income is less than $1.25 a day. And this was actually accomplished 5 years ahead of schedule. It was supposed to be accomplished by 2015. They actually cut in half the number of people who are living in extreme poverty, which is that measure by the United Nations, $1.25 a day. They cut that in half by 2010. So that was met. Target 1B, achieve full and productive employment and decent work for all, including women and young people. And there are still globally 300 million people who have work but live in extreme poverty. Okay? So it's not just that people don't work and are living in poverty. There's 300 million people, roughly the population of the United States, who still work, have a job, and are living in extreme poverty. And target 1C, to cut in half between 1990 and 2015 the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. So maybe you have a question on this one, like, what does it mean to suffer from hunger? Can we clarify that? And they did. Essentially what they mean is that they are undernourished, is essentially that metric. And so all of these are able to be measured by objective statistics so that we can calculate that. And globally, there's still almost 800 million people who are still undernourished, including 90 million children under 5 years of age who are still undernourished. All right. And so again, over these next few slides, I want you to try best that you can, jot down some of these statistics. Hey, take a look at how are these improving global development, because these are all goals that the United Nations has set. We're going to look at them moving forward. So jot down statistics, jot down questions that you may have, and keep track of this, because I actually think that this could be an FRQ question. So the United Nations provides updates, especially now that that 2015 has passed. We can take a look at this. Extreme global poverty rates were cut in half, by more than half since 1990. We know that. We mentioned that they actually accomplished that 5 years ahead of schedule. Now, since we've accomplished this 5 years ahead of schedule, does that mean game over, we won? Of course not. Hey, what ends up happening is that at the end of these periods of time, so it started in 2000, that's why they're called the Millennium Development Goals, and they were set to be accomplished by 2015. Well, some were, some weren't. And so in 2015, the United Nations Development Program, and member states sat down and developed a new set of goals called the Sustainable Development Goals, which started in 2015 and are set to be accomplished by 2030. And that's what you see in the bottom left there in that blue font, to end poverty and hunger everywhere by 2030. Those are the Sustainable Development Goals. And so some of these Sustainable Development Goals, which we will look at later in this lecture, one of them is to eliminate extreme global poverty, meaning that by 2030 there are no people living on under $1.25 a day anywhere in the world. Now, even if that's accomplished, does that mean, okay, that's all good? Well, no, because in addition to that, they also say that by 2030, they want to cut in half the number of people who are living in poverty according to national definitions. Okay, so people who are living in the United States definition of poverty. They also want to cut in half the number of people who are living in Niger's definition of poverty. So they have that as well. They have a global definition of $1.25 a day, but they also say they want to cut in half the number of people living under national definitions of poverty. So on each of these slides, we're going to provide you some updates of where where we are as a world in respect to the Millennium Development Goals, but more importantly for us now, because we're already past the Millennium Development Goals. More important for us now, it is the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're going to provide some insight into what those are going to look like. Goal number 2 under the Millennium Development Goals was to achieve universal primary education. The specific target was to ensure that by 2015, children everywhere, boys and girls alike, will be able to complete a full course of primary schooling. So, K-5, basically. Now, we hit 91% in 2015. All right, 91% of all children were able to get a primary education in 2015. Now, that was an improvement from the year 2000 when only 83% of children worldwide were able to attend primary school. However, there are still 57 million children who are of age to be in primary school and are not. 57 million children in the world are still not in primary school. So that's that 9% that we're looking at. And so we have to keep working towards that. And so they mentioned that by 2015, especially in developing regions, reached 91%. And so the future goal, the Sustainable Development Goal, which are the new goals that we have from now until 2015 to 2030, is to ensure quality education for all. And more specifically, what they mean by that is to ensure that boys and girls get primary and secondary education. They also want to make sure that they have some other goals regarding early childhood education as well, making sure that they are ready for primary school when they get there. Goal number 3 was to promote gender equality and to empower women with a specific target of eliminating gender disparity in primary and secondary education, preferably by 2005 and in all levels of education no later than 2015. And in developing countries, LDCs, and periphery and semi-periphery states, they did achieve the elimination of a gender disparity in education in all levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary. But in addition to that, in one of the other measurements of this was looking at the labor force. And remember, we measured how gender disparities in a country are indicative of their level of development. Well, globally, 3/4 of working age men are in the labor force. So 75% of working age men are in the labor force, but only half of working age women are. So trying to improve that is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the world has achieved equality in primary education between boys and girls. And so the future moving forward is to have no discrimination against women or girls, no violence against women, and to end practices like early marriage, child marriage, as well as forced marriage and other forms of gender inequality throughout the world. Goal number 4 is reducing child mortality with a specific target of reducing by 2/3 between 1990 and 2015 the under 5 mortality rate. Now we have to clarify this because for our classroom that is a combination of infant mortality rate and child mortality rate. All right, so we have to clarify that. Infant mortality, remember, infant mortality is under 1. Child mortality is 1 to 5. In this case, they just call it under 5 mortality. And those numbers fell. Under 5 mortality fell from 90 deaths per 1,000 in 1990 to 43 deaths per 1,000 by 2015. However, Children in rural areas are still 1.7 times more likely to die before their 5th birthday than children living in urban areas. And so there's still room for improvement with regards to this. So the mortality rate of children under 5 has been cut by more than half since 1990. We mentioned that it went from 90 down to 43, but remember the goal was to cut it by 2/3. So it wasn't accomplished, but still improvement. And so again, they reevaluated at 2015, and with the Sustainable Development Goals, they said that they want to reduce neonatal mortality, which is mortality in the first 28 days of a child's life, which is their most vulnerable time period. So it's referred to as neonatal mortality rate, first 28 days of life, death before their essentially their first month of life. They want to reduce that to under 12 deaths per 1,000, and they want under 5 to be less than 25 per 1,000. Remember that it is currently at 43 per 1,000, according to the Millennium Development Goals, which is down from 90 in 1990. So just during my lifetime, we've seen it drop from 90 down to 43, and they're shooting by 2030 to have it down to 25. Goal number 5 is to improve maternal health, so mothers giving birth. Target 5 was to 5A, reduce by 3/4 between 1990 and 2015 the maternal mortality ratio, so mothers dying during childbirth. And target 5B, achieved by 2015, universal access to reproductive health. And so the maternal mortality rate has been cut in half, nearly in half, since 1990. But in 2013, still 289,000 mothers died during childbirth. Remember, they wanted to reduce it by 3/4. It has been cut nearly in half, so didn't quite meet that. In addition to that, regarding 5B, only about half of all pregnant women receive the recommended amount of care after childbirth, called antenatal care. Just going to the doctor for follow-ups and things like that. Only about half of all pregnant women receive that recommended amount of care. And so that is concerning. So the maternal mortality rate fell by 45% since 1990. Again, the goal was 3/4, so 75%. So didn't quite meet that. The Sustainable Development Goal in the future is to ensure universal access to reproductive health. So a couple of different elements of that are specifically mentioned. They wanted guaranteed access to reproductive health care, being able to meet doctors, nurses, making sure that a trained physician is present at the birth of all children, access to contraception if a woman chose to use it. Which is another part of the Sustainable Development Goal, making sure that women have a much stronger voice when it comes to politics, when it comes to the labor force, when it comes to reproductive rights. So these are goals to help improve the level of development between 2015 and 2030. Goal number 6 is dealing with diseases, specifically HIV/AIDS, malaria, and they just say other diseases. And in particular, one of them that is specifically mentioned in the 48 indicators is tuberculosis. All right, so here are some of the goals that they wanted to achieve. Have halted by 2015 and begun to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS. Achieve by 2010 universal access to treatment for HIV/AIDS for all those who need it. And to have halted by 2015 and begun to reverse the incidence of malaria and again, other major diseases, and one that is specifically mentioned is tuberculosis. And so from the year 2000 to 2013, global HIV infections fell 40%. However, 35 million people are still living with HIV/AIDS. And more than 75% of all new infections occur in just 15 countries. So the overwhelming majority of HIV/AIDS cases are coming from a relatively small number of countries. So if we can improve that in those countries, then that's going to lead to a dramatic drop-off, which is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. Between 2000 and 2013, new HIV infections fell by 40%, and 37 million tuberculosis deaths have been averted. And so for the Sustainable Development Goals, again by 2030, it's to ensure healthy and long lives for all. And so by 2030, some of the goals that they want to eliminate, this is a direct quote, by 2030, end the epidemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and combat hepatitis, waterborne diseases, and other communicable diseases. That is the goal, one of the goals that is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 7 is about environmental sustainability. So here are some of the specific targets that they were trying to achieve. Integrate the principles of sustainable development into country policies and programs and reverse the loss of environmental resources. Reduce biodiversity loss, achieving by 2010 a significant reduction in the rate of loss. Have, by 2015, the proportion of the population without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. And to achieve by 2020 a significant improvement in the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers. So, some statistics to support some of the things that have been happening. During the last period of time, we've actually reduced the amount of deforestation. Annually, we were losing about 8.3 million hectares of forest. That is now down to 5.2 million hectares annually. So it's been an improvement of over 30% annually. Now, obviously, we want to continue reducing that. And in fact, they actually address the problem with the hole in the ozone layer, and they actually predict that the ozone layer is expected to recover by the middle of the 21st century. So that's important. In addition to that, regarding sanitation, they said that 2.1 billion people have gained access to improved sanitation, as in particular meaning access to a toilet, might be indoor plumbing. There's different things like that. However, there are still 2.4 billion people who still use unimproved sanitation, as well as almost 1 billion people who practice what is known as open defecation. They don't have access to a toilet, anything like that. And so in those cases, there's certainly an issue of disease that could be passed as a result of that. So trying to improve those things is big. In addition to that, referring to slum dwellers, this is going to come up a lot more during our cities and urban land use unit. More than 880 million people, so almost 1 billion people, still live in slums today, compared with 792 million in 2000 and 689 million in 1990, which means the number of slum dwellers have been increasing over the last 2 decades. Now, part of this is driven by just overall growth in LDCs. We know that in stage 2 of the demographic transition model, there's a lot of growth. So in periphery countries, part of that is driven by just overall growth, as well as continued rural to urban migration. And what we've seen is the development of what are known as primate cities. Cities, especially in LDCs, that have disproportionately larger populations than the rest of the country. And so to take a look at how things have improved, again, we mentioned 2.6 billion people have gained access to improved drinking water since 1990. However, there are still, I think, roughly about 13% of the world's population that is still does not have access to that. So sustainable development goals are to ensure access to drinking water and sanitation for all. Universal access to safe and affordable water, improved sanitation, as well as the end by 2030 of the practice of open defecation. The final goal is a partnership for global development. So I'm going to read through the targets and I'm going to give you one specific example of a statistic that we could use to measure this. The first target, develop further an open, rule-based, predictable, non-discriminatory trading and financial system. Address the special needs of least developed countries. We saw that on the Human Development Index. Address the special needs of landlocked developing countries and small island developing states. We saw those on the Human Development Index. Deal comprehensively with the debt problems of developing countries. In cooperation with pharmaceutical companies, provide access to affordable essential drugs in developing countries, which would then in turn improve goal number 6, which talks about ending some of those diseases. And then finally, in cooperation with the private sector, make available benefits of new technology, especially information and communication. And so they're going to address that in the Sustainable Development Goals. But one of the things that we could measure here with regards to the Millennium Development Goals is that by 2015, 79% of all goods from developing countries were able to enter developed countries, MDCs, duty-free, meaning that more money is flowing back to LDCs from MDCs. And this is a great example of that international trade approach working. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is universally a good thing, as we've discussed in other parts of the course, because think of, for example, monocropping. As LDCs focus on a very limited amount of crops with the intent to ship and sell them in MDCs, well, that land is being used for economic gain, whereas they might need it to feed their people, a growing population. So there is that concern. But from a development standpoint, it's really improving the level of development in those countries. And so in 2014, aid money increased to $135.2 billion. And so they want to ensure, again, further, this global partnership for development. And so this is where most of the Sustainable Development Goals are aimed, as we're going to see, with an emphasis on sustainability, improving development, without reducing resources for future generations. It's about balance. So what is sustainable development? I've been saying it this entire lecture. So what is it? Here's the definition. Development providing for the needs of the present generation without diminishing the options of the future generations. It's also a name to a given name given to an emerging school of thought in the 1990s, which is actually a name given to the set of goals that run from 2015 to 2030. And so here are some of the main ideas that are part of that. But instead of talking about the main ideas, let's take a look at the actual goals themselves. So here are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I'm going to read each of the goals in their entirety. And while I do that, I want you guys to be thinking about, what do you think is, number one, what do you think is most important for improving development? So out of these 17, which do you think is going to make the biggest difference in terms of development? Which one do you personally believe is most important? Which one would you want to see most accomplished? And then which ones do you have questions about? Like which one would you want to go and look for more information on? And then finally, which one do you think will be the hardest to achieve? So which one do you think is most important? Which one is most important to you? Which ones do you have questions about? Which ones do you think will be the hardest? So make sure that you answer to those four as I read the next 17. So here we go. Starting with number one. The goal is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Goal number two, end hunger and to achieve food security and improve nutrition and to promote sustainable agriculture. Number three, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Number four, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Number five, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Number six, ensure availability and sustainably manage water and sanitation for all. Number seven, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Number eight, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Number nine, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Number 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. Number 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Number 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. 13, take urgent care to combat climate change and its impacts. 14, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. 15, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. 16, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And 17, finally, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. So which is most important? Which is most important to you? Which did you have questions about? Which would be the hardest? And finally, the Microloan Foundation is a really interesting organization that provides small loans to individuals in developing countries to try and improve their level of development. So here's an article from the Microloan Foundation. And they recognize that nearly 800 million people live in poverty, 70% of which are women. And so their mission is to, quote, provide the poorest women in sub-Saharan Africa with the tools and skills to enable them to work their own way out of poverty. So they provide classes, they provide loans, they teach them how to use that money, and 99% of all of their loans have been repaid, which allows them to reinvest in other businesses. And that's part of those sustainable development goals. I'll see you guys in class. We'll discuss. Have a good evening.